You might have heard that the word utopia comes from Greek, and it simultaneously means the perfect place and also no place. And the common modern interpretation of this word is that the perfect place or society is impossible. But what if I told you that the book that introduced this word into the English lexicon wasn't trying to say that at all? Okay, so before we begin, we have to go through some history. A lot of history. So let's begin at the beginning. Utopia was written by Tomas More, and it was originally published in Latin. Now, let's put a pin in that. It was originally published in the year 1516. This was during the rule of King Henry VIII, right in the middle of the Renaissance, the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, and also the beginning of the Age of Exploration. The early 1500s in general was sort of a transitionary period for Europe, and especially England, where Tomas More spent the vast majority of his life living in. The Renaissance was still in full swing. Neoclassical art and philosophy, which is essentially just Europe rediscovering Roman and Greek philosophy that other parts of the world have had for hundreds of years at this point, but whatever. All of that was still very much in vogue. But during this time, the Protestant Reformation was also starting to take hold over Central Europe, and while England wouldn't leave the Catholic Church for another 25 years or so, their Protestant sentiment was still starting to prickle up in the British Isles. This was also the start of the Age of Exploration, where Spain and Portugal specifically at this time held specific holdings in this new world. And while England wasn't in the colonizing game just quite yet, they were certainly gearing up to that. This was back when most of Europe knew the New World had existed, but had little to no idea what this New World was like. So again, let's put a pin in that. That's going to come up later. Finally, we have to talk about the shifting economic conditions of the time, which is arguably specifically why Tomas More even wrote Utopia in the first place. You see, at the time, the economic situation in England was starting to shift from a feudalist society to a capitalist society. Now, historians and economists argue when capitalism truly emerged in England, but suffice to say, at this time, we definitely start seeing elements of capitalism, or at the very least, mercantilism, which is essentially what economists consider to be like the transitionary phase from feudalism to capitalism. Needless to say, we start seeing a closure of the commons, leaving a lot of serfs and peasants homeless, moneyless, and jobless. As much of the once agricultural land was transformed into pastures for sheep. This naturally led to an increase in crime, particularly robbery, because, well, they were starving and had no other choice. So in this situation, what do you think the British legal system did? Did they A, force wealthy landlords to reopen the commons, B, distribute necessities such as food and clothing equally, C, start a welfare state to provide people with jobs and compensation for those who were prevented from working, or D, murder all of them? Of course, they chose to murder all of them. Now, Tomas More was a lawyer at this time, which lawyer at this time basically just means prosecutor, for your frame of reference. And he thought that the system was unnecessary, stupid, and cruel, because it was unnecessary, stupid, and cruel. But whenever he would bring up this obvious fact to anybody, they would respond in a, well, could you come up with anything better? And so Tomas More wrote Utopia, doing just that, creating a better society. But our story doesn't end there, because over 300 years later, this obscure philosopher, I don't know, you might have heard him, he's called Karl Marx. And him, along with Friedrich Engels and other philosophers, created this little philosophy called Marxism. And their ideas were quite similar to those exposed by More, at least when it came to the economic situation. And this was quickly noticed by both Marxist thinkers and non-Marxist thinkers alike. Naturally, the preceding century or so became muddled with both pro-Marxist readings of the books and anti-Marxist readings of the books. And, well, at this point, Utopia was already considered a classic piece of literature and was taught all over the English-speaking world. And if you know anything about English academia, they hate changing up their readings. Even if a work is now considered to be problematic, Robinson Crusoe, or if there's a better work that discusses a certain topic, To Kill a Mockingbird, and I should know, I'm an English major. Oh, awesome. How long did this happen? Oh my god. By the way, I'm not saying that all English professors are stubborn about changing their reading lists. I know many teachers who have switched up their reading lists. I even had a teacher who literally went up against the established high school curriculum because he refused to teach us To Kill a Mockingbird, instead giving us books actually like written by like a black person to discuss like racism in America. So yeah, I'm just more talking about like the overall, like the standard English curriculum and professors and teachers are that like the standard professors and teachers are being forced to teach. This isn't about individual English teachers. This is about English academia. Okay, just wanted to get that right. Plus, in all fairness, Utopia is one of the best examples of an English pre-Shakespearean piece of Renaissance literature. It's actually really an antithesis of what the Renaissance really was. So it's really good from a like English history and English like literary tradition, or even just like a European literary history, just like in general. But we'll get into that a little bit more in the analysis section. But suffice to say, right now, academia was put in a little tricky spot. How were they going to teach Utopia? And more importantly, how are they going to translate it? So remember how it was originally published in Latin? Yeah, we're going to take that pin. Translating any work of fiction or even non-fiction is complicated, especially of older works. There seems to be two main translation approaches. The first is translating the text as literally as possible. The other main way is translating the work so that it has the same message, the same essence, but flows the way or keeps the overall message for this new audience. This is actually usually more popular in poetry, but even in works of fiction, this is used sometimes to better communicate to modern day audiences what the writer meant at a time in a way they would understand. The biggest problem in Utopia when it comes to translation is whether or not making direct references to Marxism, or more specifically to communism, or not. And this is actually kind of a tricky situation. On the one hand, making a direct reference to communism or Marxist theory seems revisionist. After all, no matter how you look at it, there is no way Tomas More could have been referencing Marxism because, well, Karl Marx wouldn't be born for like 300 years. But at the same time, it feels a little disingenuous not to discuss Marxism or other socialist theories because the parallels are so uncanny. And look, in my personal, I think it's ridiculous not to make those comparisons as a modern reader. But enough with the backstory, let's get into what this book is actually about and some popular interpretations of it. And welcome everyone to the part of the video where we discuss the book in question, Utopia. So, one important thing to note is that the book is written in a classical pseudo-Socratic style, which, put a pin in that, it's going to come up later in my interpretation section. So the book is separated into 3 parts. A prologue, which was written as a letter to Peter Giles, an actual real person who Tomas More asks him to look over his manuscript, account, to make sure it's as accurate as to what happened as possible. Now, one other thing we should note is that this entire story is completely made up. It's completely fictional. Every thought and idea expressed came from More's mind and More's mind alone. More decided to write this book as if the whole book is based off of a real conversation he had with Raphael, a Portuguese explorer who, again, is a completely fictional human being, meaning all of Raphael's beliefs and personality are constructions of More's imagination, and possibly even a reflection of his own beliefs, but we'll get into that later. Again, let's put a pin in that for now. Then we go into Book 1. Now, interestingly enough, Book 1 was originally written and published after Book 2. A sort of Star Wars episode 1 through 3 situation. So Book 1 is kind of a prequel to Book 2, serving as a setup to Book 2. So Book 1 covers the story of the start of Tomas More's and Raphael's and Peter Giles' conversation. This whole first book, like a classical Greek or Greco-Roman work, in which the conversation delves into the real problems of the time in their society, which in this case is England and more broadly Western Europe. This is accomplished mostly through stories, and sometimes stories within stories, and other forms of anecdotal or vague statistical evidence. So the two, Tomas More and Raphael, Peter basically doesn't really contribute anything to the conversation, continues this discussion for a while. Raphael takes everyone and everything is stupid and corrupt, and the entire system could be run better if the people in charge weren't actually fucking morons. And Thomas takes the more sensible position of, well, I basically agree with everything you say, but I don't know how we could possibly improve society and what it would look like. Basically the classical, well, can you come up with a better country/society? This leads into book 2 of Utopia, which is basically just Raphael describing different aspects of utopian society, from daily life to government and economic structures, warfare, religion, public health, and slavery. Yeah, slavery. I mean, it was written by an Englishman in the 16th century. What do we expect, really?
Hi everyone, so editing me here. I just quickly wanted to make a little note about the whole slavery thing. So Thomas More's conception of slavery is not chattel slavery. Actually it's kind of anti-chattel slavery. It's still not purely anti-slavery, obviously. But like his perspective of slavery is essentially forced prison labor, which is still wrong and is still slavery. But I just thought it was an interesting thing of note that he was actually pretty progressive on this one topic, not only for his time, but which is basically, the modern conception of acceptable slavery is what he was proposing in the 1500s. Obviously, I still don't believe it, and it's still bad. It's still slavery. It's still yikes. But it's just a little interesting, though.
Basically, book 2 is essentially like 100 pages of pure world building, with a few footnotes from Tomas More and Peter Giles, giving his brief perspective or reaction to the things being described. The ending of the book is just a page or so of Thomas reflecting on what Raphael had just described to him, and that is the end of the book. Okay, so now that you all have a brief rundown of the book, let's finally get into the fun stuff. Okay, so a couple things we need to clear up before we get into this section. As I mentioned earlier, there are several different types of translations of Utopia, and depending on what translation you read, you might come up with different interpretations of the book. So the translation I will be using is the one in my textbook that I had to buy for school, which was published by the BROADVIEW Anthology of British Literature by William P. Waver. Text will be up on the screen. And translated by G.C. Richards. So this version chooses to not draw the parallels to communism and socialism, but they do modernize the language so it is easier to read for a modern audience. And a lot of the popular interpretations are also coming from said textbook, and also discussions I had in my English 205 class and coming from my English 205 teacher. So it might seem kind of limited, but since these interpretations are those that are widely espoused and taught at American universities, so I thought it was still a pretty good sample size of interpretations you have probably heard before, or in general, just kind of out there. But naturally, I'm not going to be talking about every single interpretation of this book. I just wanted to make that clear. So if you would like to express your interpretations of the book, or popular interpretations that you might have heard from, maybe from your class, from your English class, or you read online, or wherever, please comment down below. I would love to hear more about it. For the sake of brevity, we're just going to be using the interpretations that I have heard of. Okay, so first off, let's talk about the question I'm sure everyone here has on their mind. Was this book meant to be taken seriously? I mean, Tomas More could have just been sarcastic the entire time. After all, he might not have believed a single word. I'm saying a single word he said in that entire book. We will never know. I mean, this whole video could just be sarcasm. You'll never know for sure. So, okay, this is a legit interpretation that I have heard of repeatedly, actually. So basically, the evidence for this comes from some of the language is a bit witty and could be read as sarcastic. And so therefore, the entire book is supposed to be ironic. Because that just makes perfect sense. There's more, okay, alright. There's the fact that Tomas More was Catholic, and this supposed utopia. Even though, Utopia is just the name of the place. Not necessarily just utopia, but whatever. Okay. Society, alright? So this utopia society has things like urethra and divorce. Things that the Catholic Church doesn't endorse at that time. And Tomas More was Catholic. And we all know that every single individual Catholic believes exactly what the Catholic Church believes, and the exact same way the Catholic Church teaches, because as we all know, Catholics are just a bunch of mindless followers, especially during the Renaissance and the Protestant Reformation, where people were totally not openly criticizing the church. Definitely. Plus, there are contradictions in this society. There are contradictions in the logic sometimes. And so it's meant to be sarcastic, and actually utopia, it's just supposed to be a dystopian society. Okay, alright. Yeah. So to be honest here, this was a sort of like death of the author situation, where people personally think that utopia is actually a dystopian society. That would be fine. Like, I mean, and valid, no one says you have to like the society being described in Utopia. I mean, there are certainly aspects that I don't like, and that's fine. That's fine. It's literature. It's meant to be interpreted, and people are allowed to have opinions on it, and I think that's completely fine and fair. But my problem with this interpretation is when people insist that this was More's intention. That it was More's intention to create a dystopian society and not a utopian society, or whatever. And this is where I just find the whole idea absolutely ridiculous. I mean, the best evidence comes at the end. Literally, like the last few lines of the book, when More says,
When Raphael had finished his story, I was left thinking that not a few of that people's customs and laws were absurd. Not only their method of waging war, their rights and religion and other institutions, but above all, that which is their chief foundation entire system. Their communal way of life, with shared goods and no money. This alone utterly overthrows the nobility. magnificence, splendor, and majesty that are, in the opinion of the common people, the true glories and ornaments of a commonwealth.
I cannot agree with all he said, and yet I readily admit that there are many features of the utopian commonwealth that I could more easily wish for in our own societies than hope to see realized.
And I think that last line right there disproves the dystopian argument right there. The fact that Tomas More sees some of Utopia's, customs as one that can be implemented into English society is noteworthy. It's very noteworthy, actually. I also think that this kind of disproves the whole notion of all this being sarcastic or ironic. It just doesn't make sense for me at the time. Why would Tomas More be satirizing communal ways of living at a time when this was hardly being discussed?
Hi, editing here, me again. I just wanted to add a little note that I learned later. So there is actually some evidence suggesting that communal ways of life were being discussed at this time. Though I should also mention it was definitely not being discussed in mainstream academic circles or elite circles. This was actually more of a peasant movement and a peasant ideology kind of going around at this time. And even then, it was still very much in its infancy at the time. So Tomas More might have possibly have heard of it, though it's just as equally likely that he didn't. After all, it was kind of in more of a middle class sort of position. He wasn't really in a working class or working poor sort of position. But just still saying that.
This was all satirical. Why would he write the first book after the second book, which points out the real problems in English society? These were real problems at the time, and we do have other evidence that Tomas More did believe that some of these issues were real problems. And not only that, he actively, in this first section, makes fun of the people who claim that nothing could change, or that this was the best possible system, and then turn around and make a serious, ill out there suggestion on an alternative society or an alternative way that society could be run. One that was better than the English system. And also try to keep in mind that just because sincerity is dead now doesn't mean it was dead in the early 1500s. So this kind of goes on with the sincerity point, and this is basically the idea that Tomas More doesn't actually endorse any of Utopia as a fictional society that he created, ideals, or, at the very least didn't see Utopia as Utopia. This mostly comes from the fact that Tomas More says,
I can't agree, I said. Life can never be happy or satisfying where all things are held in common. How could sufficient supply of goods be kept up? Each person would spend less time working. If hope of a personal gain does not motivate a man, he becomes lazy and relies on the industry of others.
And this section right here gets a lot of attention and is arguably the best quote to support the idea that Tomas More doesn't endorse Utopia's ideals, or at the very least the whole thing held in common part. Communism. That part, that's only part of the quote. The rest of the quote goes like this.
But when people are driven to labor by poverty and are not allowed to keep up what they have worked for, is there not bound to be continual trouble, bloodshed, and revolution? Not to mention the magistrates must lose both authority and dignity, for how can there be any place for them among men who are all on the same level? Escapes me.
So this very section already kind of argues against its own previous point. Like, it's saying when the basics of like people's like needs, like basic needs, are being denied, when their labor value is being denied, people revolt, which isn't a very pro-capitalist thing to say, if you ask me. But in all fairness, it's not necessarily an anti-capitalist statement either. But even if we take this passage as anti-communist or anti-communalist or whatever, it doesn't matter. It doesn't necessarily mean that this entire book believes in this point. Case in point, literally the next section, when in the first few lines, Raphael disavows the entire argument.
I am not surprised that you think so, Raphael said, for you either have no conception, or a false one, of the sort of state I describe. If you had been with me in Utopia, and had yourself seen how people behave, as I did, for I lived there for more than 5 years, I would have never wished to leave except for the desire to make that new world widely known. You certainly would admit that you have never seen a more well-ordered people anywhere.
Now, one might rightfully argue that this isn't a very sound argument given by Raphael, and is basically saying that More doesn't know what he's talking about, and that he had learned from personal experience that this idea does work. Which is further complicated by the fact that we, as an audience, know that Utopia isn't a real place. See, however, in the conceit of this story, Utopia is a real place.
So, this is being recorded on a different day with a different camera, actually. So, if this section looks a bit inconsistent, that is why. Just so you should all know that technical difficulties arise sometimes. Okay, but let's get back to the video. So, within this narrative of the story, we should view Raphael's argument as more valid, since he has personal experience of how such a society does work, and More is only questioning such a society. The implication also assumes that Tomas More is actually Tomas More, which is a fair reading, and in all honesty, I do believe there is some merit in this interpretation, but how does that explain Raphael Holland, who takes up most of the book and whose ideas were barely challenged and passed, but that's totally different from and completely would demolish society's structures, and that's a point, a very good point, because people don't like change or some bullshit like that. Honestly, they don't even really make that last point in the argument. They just kind of say it would be changed and leaves it at that. So in light of that, there is another interpretation of this book that says that Tomas More isn't actually Tomas More, or doesn't actually represent Tomas More's actual thoughts, but that Raphael Holland is. And I think this interpretation of the story is more accurate, though not quite how I personally read it. I see it is more like the actual Tomas More is essentially believes everything that Raphael is saying, at least on a subconscious level. Because, why else would he write a book pretending these ideas, especially when things like communism and representative democracy, etc. were barely ideas floating around in Europe, keyword Europe, at the time. I mean, sure, these ideas are floated around all the time today, but you have to remember, this wasn't just pre-Marx. This was pre-Locke, pre-Smith, pre-fucking Calvinism. Like, how could this work be anything but a sincere place of intellectual and creative thought experiment on how the world could work differently?
So editing me here again, just like a tiny point that I didn't mention in the video that I feel like adds more to my point. So Raphael as a character is actually very much glorified. In the very beginning of the book, there's this passage, I'll probably quickly flash it up on the screen, you can pause it and read it, where essentially it sets up as Raphael as a very intelligent person. The first couple pages of the book, Tomas More is basically just praising Raphael Holland and saying how smart he is and how he should be members of the King's Court and everything because he gives such good advice and stuff. So Raphael is supposed to be seen as this very smart person, and the narrative doesn't do anything to really make him seem crazy, maybe besides the point that some of these ideas that he is espousing might seem crazy to some people. But him as a character is not demonized at all. If anything, he's over-glorified.
Okay, but if that's all true, why even create the character of Raphael Holland? After all, why not just expose these ideas directly on the page? Own up to his own opinion. Well, for one, it's more entertaining. You're about a faraway land that is shockingly similar to home in its material conditions, but radically different in social conditions, rather than reading a 400-page dossier about what is wrong with society and how it could be better. I'm looking at you, enlightenment fingers. Second of all, that style of writing wasn't popular or established at the time. As I mentioned earlier, the type of writing style that was popular around the time was this sort of neoclassical sort of writing, similar to Greek or Roman works, which this book is clearly heavily inspired by. And in all of these Greco-Roman philosophical escapades, there is almost always a contrasting opinion to the, let's just say, our protagonists. Big air quotes there, because it doesn't actually follow the traditional hero's journey kind of or mythical structure of storytelling whatsoever, but you get the point. Anyways, Tomas More seems to be filling in this counter figure role. He can't actually fill in the role of Raphael because he wasn't actually an explorer. He never went to the New World, and as I mentioned earlier, probably knew very little about it, as most Europeans at the time did. And since More has no authority on this new world and its people, he couldn't exactly say that he knew a place called Utopia because, suspension of disbelief. No one would believe him. But if Raphael, the Portuguese explorer, did, well, now that's more believable. And then, of course, there's the fact that it was a way to make sure that the aristocracy of the time wouldn't condemn him for treason, because he, Tomas More, the Sheriff of London, wasn't saying that stuff that could potentially get him killed. No, it was Raphael. You know, Raphael, the explorer who was no longer on the continent, and so you can't double check. It was Raphael. Raphael said it, not Thomas. No. Now, okay, you might say, well, if that was the case, how do you explain Tomas More eventually being martyred about 20 years later? Well, for one, he died because of his religious beliefs. He was a devout Catholic living in Protestant England, and yeah, it was not about political ones. And I don't know if you know this, but people, especially Christians, are more willing to die for their religious beliefs than their political beliefs. Also, it was 20 years later, and things can change in 20 years. Plus, regardless, it was still a scathing piece of literature to write at the time. I mean, with quotes from Raphael like this.
Your sheep, I replied, which used to be so mild and content, are now, it is said, so greedy and wild, that they devour men, laying waste and depopulating fields, houses, and towns. For in those parts of the realm that produces the finest, and therefore most costly wool, nobles and gentlemen, and even holy abbots, are unsatisfied with revenues and annual profits they derive from their estates. No longer content with merely leading an idle life and contributing nothing to the good of their country, they must also do it real harm. They leave no ground to be tilled, enclose every bit of land for pasture, pull down houses, and destroy towns, leaving only a church for a barn. Thus, so that one fat cat, an insatiable and terrible scourge to his household, might enclose some thousands of acres of tillable land in a single fence. Many tenants are injected. Some, through fraud or violence, lose their goods. Others are so wearied by oppression that they are driven to sell. Thus, by hook or by crook, poor wretcheders are compelled to leave their home. Men, women, husbands, wives, orphans, widows, parents with little children, and a family not rich but numerous, for farm work requires many hands. Away they must go, I say, from the hearth of the home, and find no shelter. All their household furnitures, which would not fetch a gross price even if they could wait for a purchaser, must be sold.
I mean, holy shit! Could you ever imagine someone today writing something like this, like maybe against like industrial farming or oil and gas companies? I mean, they would get in so much trouble. Like, oh my gosh, it would never get published in any sort of mainstream by any sort of mainstream publisher or publication. Alright, I think I made my point. Next, I guess we should probably talk about what, in my opinion, is the most misinterpreted title of all time. Utopia. But what does it mean? How do I explain this? I don't think the title is the sort of secret message that everyone thinks it is. First of all, Utopia isn't even the full title. The full title is Utopia, the best state of a commonwealth, and the new island of Utopia, a truly golden handbook, no less beneficial than entertaining, by the distinguished and elegant author Tomas More, citizen and sheriff of the famous city of London. Okay, so let's break down this actual title.
subheading the best state of a suggesting that this is a debate about the best society can be. Notice the language that's saying here, it's best, not perfect, but best. These are two different words. Best just means, the greatest something can be. Perfect means something without flaws. This is not talking about a perfect commonwealth, but the best commonwealth. And not even just like a commonwealth in general, but the state of a commonwealth. Not like a fundamental sort of thing, but a certain state of the commonwealth. Meaning a phase of a commonwealth, or a, condition within a commonwealth. This isn't supposed to also even be talking just about a particular society, but of societies in general. Okay? Great. And then there's the second part of the heading, and the new island of Utopia suggests that Utopia is a real place or a newly discovered one. Okay, so remember earlier when I said that, most Europeans were familiar with this idea of the New World, but they have no real context of what this new world was actually like, what the people were like, and how much was really out there. So the idea of this utopia is not out of the realm of possibility in the minds of the average European, even the literate ones, given the way in which utopia is written and presented. I wouldn't be surprised if there were some people at the time who thought that this place wasn't real, which is why naming this island Utopia, which is why the name of the island Utopia is so fitting. Remember, even though the word in general is translated to mean the perfect place, that meaning the perfect place that can't exist in the real world, the actual Greek translation means both simultaneously the perfect place and no place. Not the impossible place, not the unattainable place, but no place, meaning it doesn't exist, meaning the perfect place does not exist. At least it doesn't exist now. So what I think Tomas More was trying to say with this title is, yeah, this isn't actually a new island. This new island of Utopia doesn't actually exist. It's not a real place. The other part of the above mentioned interpretation is that More believes that this place couldn't exist. And again, I think that's a misreading of the text, and even honestly, this title proves that no, I do think he believes that a utopia-like place can exist, or his idea of a utopia place can exist. Again, he is saying that this is not just about the new island of Utopia, and the new island of Utopia. The main kind of argument that is particularly presented in book 1 is the best state of a commonwealth, meaning the best a place can be, which relates to Utopia because Utopia is essentially a counterexample and is being used as an example of the best state of the commonwealth. The best state of a commonwealth is Utopia. You see? So Utopia is the best state of a commonwealth. They're interchangeable, at least in More's opinion. Now, I'm not saying that, how Utopia is described in the book is actually the best state of a commonwealth or a country or whatever. But Tomas More did believe it.
I'd like to bring up the point that Utopia was specifically designed to mirror England specifically. So I guess I should answer the question you've all been asking. Is it Marxist? Well,
I say we can ignore for wars come immediately, but let us consider what happens every day. Now there are a great many idle noblemen who not only live like drones off their laborers of others, such as their tenants, whom they squeeze the utmost rising their rents, for that is the only way to get money they know, being otherwise so extravagant as to beggars themselves, but also carry about with them huge crowd of parasites, whom they never lend a trade by which to live. When their master dies, or they themselves fall ill, they soon turn out, for it is easier to maintain the idle than the sick, and in any case, the heir can't always support such a big household as his father, so in the meantime, their energies turn to starving, if not to thieving, for what can they do, when by the vein bound life they have worn out both clothes and health, sickly and ragged as they are, gentlemen will not encourage them, and country folk dare not, knowing well that they somehow softly brought up in idleness and luxury, and has been worked to strut around in sword and buckler, looking down with a swaggering expression on his whole neighborhood, and thinking to himself miles above everyone, is not fit to render honest service to a poor man with spade and a hoe for scoutly wages on a frugal fare.
I mean, it's up to you. Well, to be quite frank, I actually haven't heard any popular interpretation that claims that this book is Marxist or communist exactly. So keep in mind, I attended a liberal university in a far-right country with fascistic tendencies that has basically banned teaching of Marxism and other anti-capitalist ideologies. So, keep that in mind. Though, from what I can tell, based on my research, is that in general, the Marxist interpretation of this book is that Utopia is an example of what is called primitive communism, which is kind of a loaded term and has some negative racial implications. But that's a different topic for another time. If you actually want to learn more about the problem with this idea of primitive communism, I will link a video down below that's really good that kind of talks about that. But anyways, back to the main topic of the video. Primitive communism, or as I would like to call it, the Enlightenment communism, is essentially a pre-industrial, classless, and stateless society, which Utopia, the fictional society written in the book, is an example of, or at the very least a very European example of one. There is also some Marxist interpretation that this book is, again, utopianist, in the sense that it is a form of idealism, and typically a lot of Marxists thinkers practice this idea of dialectical materialism, and again, that's a whole huge topic for another video, but essentially it's a form of rational thinking, and Utopia is seen as irrational and doesn't really use any dialectical processes, and it's a form of idealism, meaning it's an ideal society, one not rooted in material reality. And I would personally argue a little bit against this. I think this book has a really great understanding of the material reality in a sense of England, and I do believe that they have definitely this sort of idea. Again, Utopia was created as a completely fictional society that is separated purposefully, as an example point, I don't think it was actually literally meant to be a form of idealism. In fact, even in the book, it doesn't even say that this is absolutely perfect. But I don't really think that this is a form of idealism. I think that's kind of a reductive reasoning. I don't really think that gives a good example of what I was working with. And again, this was a time before all of that, like before, enlightened reasoning, before, dialectical materialism. And I think you can definitely see in this book some kind of like evidence of rational thought kind of being used. It was used in a creative lens, but just because something is used in a creative lens doesn't make it an idealist. And I think sometimes people conflate creativity with idealism, and I don't think they're exactly the same thing. Again, this is kind of a different topic for a different video, but I just wanted to kind of make that point because I know some people say this is idealist, some Marxist thinkers call this like an idealist work. And then, of course, there's the Antiimmersive Perspective, which claims that there is absolutely no connection between Utopia and Marxist theory.
The price of food has risen in many parts. Wool, too, has gone up in price. So much so that the poor who used to make clothes in England cannot now afford to buy it, and are so driven from work to idleness. For, after the great increase of pastoral land and a plague killed off a vast number of sheep, perhaps God, vexed by the owner's display of greed, sent a Miriam. It might have fallen more justly on their own heads in any case. If the number of sheep had risen, the price would have fallen because of the monopoly. Excuse me, the oligarchy. For there are more than one of them. Wealth stays in the hands of the same few, who are not obliged to sell before they wish, and they do not wish to sell until they get the price they asked. All other kinds of livestock are also highly priced for the same reason, and all the more so because of the farmhouse have been pulled down and the tillage is lessened. There are none left to raise livestock. These rich men will not rear calves as they do lambs, but buy them as lean and cheap elsewhere, and then, having fattened them up in their own pastures, resell them again for a tidy profit. I fear that the full mischief of the system has not yet been felt. Thus far it has risen the prices only where the animals are sold. Over time, though, the buyers remove them faster than they can breed, and as the supply gradually diminishes, in the area where they are brought, there will be great shortages. Thus, unscrupulous greed of a few is ruining the very thing for which your island was once counted most fortunate.
Yeah, Tomas More definitely wasn't an anti-capitalist, and there's no way he could be one because Marx wasn't born yet. And as we all know, there was absolutely no criticism of capitalism before Marx and Engels. And no, the very creation of this book is not proof that previous to that previous claim was false. No, because the book has nothing to do with the Lord and Savior capitalism, and actually it's a critique of the Protestant Reformation, and also maybe the death penalty, and no, we're not going to talk about how the Protestant worth ethic and how that might have actually allowed like capitalism to form and rise in Europe in the first place. But no, Utopia is not about capitalism. Remember that quote, that quote at the end, the one. That quote, at the end, that one, yeah, More was pro-capitalist, and also I think Utopia is like a total dystopia. I mean, communal living, no on private property. Could you imagine strangers just walking into your house and you can't just like murder them right on the spot? Like, what sort of fucking dystopian society we live in? Oh my god. Okay, okay, so maybe I was being a little exaggerated, but that's basically their talking points. I should know, I sat through an entire class mostly made up of these talking points. Yeah, liberal university indoctrinating students to becoming Marxist, my fucking ass! But regardless, this perspective is valid, of course. All literary interpretations are valid. It's just a lot of them aren't good. Though in fairness, it does have some points. Like, I don't think Tomas More intended to write a takedown of capitalism. His motivation was most likely the faults of the English penal system. In fact, the entire premise of the book starts with a conversation about the English penal system. To be quite frank, it's unlikely that Tomas More even really knew what capitalism was, but the work, whether intentional or not, became anti-capitalist. I mean, even the act of imagining a society that isn't reliant on, capitalism, that isn't reliant on markets, but rather need, is an anti-capitalist act. However, it doesn't matter if it was meant to be seen as anti-capitalist, because it is now. And that kind of goes back to the argument, why keep teaching and printing this? Why keep teaching and printing this work at all? Why is it important? And how does this book affect us today? And what does this work teach us about the past? And I think the obvious answer to those questions, while not the only answers, is one that I think a lot of people don't want to hear. So let's get into it. Okay, so why am I really making this video? And honestly, Utopia surprised me. I didn't think that anything being discussed in a book written by an English lawyer in the 1500s would ring true to me or affect me in any way. And then I read the description on how Utopia, as in the fictional society, handles public health, and well, special care is taken for the sick, who are looked after in one of 4 public hospitals that are spread out at the edge of town, a little outside the walls. These are so roomy that they seem like small towns. The purpose is to prevent the sick, however numerous, from being packed close in discomfort, and also to isolate the contagious and thus prevent their passing on their maladies to others. These hospitals are so well furnished and equipped with everything conceived to health, and the experts attending physicians provide such delicate and careful treatment that although no one is sent there involuntarily, there is hardly anybody in the whole city who, when ill, does not prefer to be cared rather than at home. This shouldn't
seem utopic. This shouldn't make me cry because it's just, society. A society taking care of its sick. And the funniest thing is, in that entire description, through the entire, just talking about the healthcare system in general, they don't even talk about health insurance or medical fees or anything like that. It's just an assumption that this sort of stuff is free. And could you imagine being in a world where you get good quality healthcare for free and still be treated like a human? Actually being treated with respect, just in general. Could you imagine living in a society that actually puts human lives first? It puts effort into hospitals and keeping them well equipped and staffed because they care about public health. As of the recording of this video, there has been a total of 45,184,449 cases and 733,068 deaths, which is the most in the world, despite our population only being the third largest in the world.
Hi, editing here, me again. So I just wanted to give a little update, just for the record, because this pandemic is not over, and there's a new variant coming soon. Who knows, by the time I post this, it might already be here, but just want to give a little update. The total cases now in the US are a total of 49,631,373, and the total deaths are now a total of 805,643 deaths just of COVID alone. Yeah, it's still the most in the world, by the way, by quite a bit actually. And God only knows how many of these numbers were tampered and how many people died of COVID-related causes or lack of resources due to COVID, etc. So that's just people who we know for a fact died of the disease that were reported, and then the federal government reported, to the world. So Lord only knows how much it actually is. It's still pretty sad. Yeah. And also, being the largest country that has the most medical technology and resources, arguably, in the entire world. But even if we ignore the pandemic and the out of account, still about 45,000 people a year die because of a lack of health insurance or proper medical care. And there's a lot of reasons why America doesn't want to provide even the most basic essentials when it comes to health for all of its citizens, and even
when, based on its own logic, and when I mean own logic, I mean capitalist logic, it makes sense to do so. But most of it has to do with, neoliberal capitalism and, if we're being honest, a little narcissism.
Hi. Okay. Editing me here, back again. I didn't really clarify what I meant in that last point, I realized. So I just want to add a little bit of clarification. When I mean narcissism, I do realize that it's like actually a disorder, and that affects a lot of people and everything. I guess kind of what I meant by narcissism, and I probably should have worded this better while I was filming and writing the script, but essentially I mean like this idea of kind of like American exceptionalism, and that America could do no wrong, and that especially our fundamental systems couldn't do anything wrong, and that our systems are fundamentally right and just, and the only thing is that we have gone astray from what the systems are supposed to do, or what like the founding fathers, or who the fuck ever, it doesn't even fucking matter anymore, intended. So that's kind of what I mean by that. Yeah.
Right there. And yet, despite all of this, our most progressive Democratic Party, isn't even really discussing even minor healthcare reforms really at this point. I mean, when has even healthcare come up in the news again? Like, I mean, 10 people died yesterday of COVID again.
And as of editing this video, it was 649 yesterday. Yeah, it's gotten worse. No, they're still not talking about it.
It's, it's almost like they can't imagine, nay, refuse to imagine a world any different. I shit you not, I have had real people tell me, like I've had real conversations with real people tell me that universal healthcare or a universal healthcare system is a utopian idea, despite the fact that other developed countries and even some developing countries have some form of universal healthcare or universal health system, and I know those tend to have a lot of problems, but it's just factually, just statistically, morally even just better than America's. Wait a second. Why is utopic even a valid criticism when it comes to policy? Why shouldn't we strive for a utopic society, even if in some way it's impossible? Isn't the whole notion of progress that we are constantly changing and evolving to get closer or to reach that utopic society or the perfect society for the time and our conditions being met? Personally, I think we're just using utopia wrong. The idea of utopia wrong. Utopia shouldn't be about a perfect, unattainable society, because that's an unproductive idea, but rather I think it should be more something like the best society, not a perfect society, because that's kind of impossible, but there is a best society, and it could be a more productive idea that is actually closer to the idea that Tomas More actually expresses in the book Utopia, is the best society, not a perfect society. So you might be asking, well, what is the best society? And well, I don't know. That's way too big of a topic for this video. But I do know this. It's not this one. It's definitely not this one. Like, we all know that, right? Like, we all know that. Like, this, we just kind of collectively agree that this is not a perfect society. Right? Okay, we can agree this isn't the best that humanity can do, right? Okay.
What's incumbent, I think, on us is to use our imaginations to try to envision a new paradigm moving forward. And for me, it's one, again, this idea of democracy really has to be at the center, right? That it's not this idea that it's either the market or just the state, is a false binary. We need to democratize both the economy and to democratize the state. And increase participation, increase democratic power at every level. So I think it's just important to remind ourselves that there are other examples, other traditions to point to learn from as we attempt to invent something new.
Yeah, I'm struck also, I've been a teacher all my life, that understanding that the world could be other than the way you're living it, other than the way the dominant discourse describes it, is revolutionary, because it means you're breaking out of the straitjacket that a system that's unsure of itself imposes on its people, precisely because it doesn't think it can compete real well with some of those other images of what could be.
That's why I think books like Utopia and other utopian fiction is so important. It gives people the opportunity to experience different worlds from their own, to see that humanity is capable of better things, that in some way society can change for the better. It challenges people's assumptions about humanity and the world, and maybe it can give possible answers to the problems in our society. Or maybe it doesn't, and that's okay too. The point of utopian fiction isn't literally creating the perfect, or honestly even the best society, like if we're being completely honest here, but creating a better society, to try and imagine a better one that reimagines our existing systems and normative social relations. But we don't see a lot of utopian fiction in the literary world, which is kind of weird, don't you think? I mean, you would think in a world in so much political unrest and slow decomposition of neoliberal capitalism, this would be the perfect time to create utopian novels, to give people an escape or hope. But we're not seeing that, at least not in the mainstream. And, well, that's because now, this part is mostly based on pieces of information I have collected from different authors and writers and marketers, as well as my own personal experience trying to get into the publishing industry and just researching and looking into the publishing industry. So take what I say with a grain of salt. The thing with the publishing industry is that very secretive and exclusive industry, and while this industry in more recent decades has become more inclusive, and the internet has shed light on what goes on in the publishing industry, We don't really know the exact reasons why they select the books they do, or why they put more money in some projects and less in others. Now, most would say that publishers select books based off of marketability, or in some way cater to the markets. And in some way that is true, especially for smaller presses. But anyone who has taken a basic marketing class knows that that's not entirely true. If you have enough money and select the right strategies, you could literally bend the market to your product. Like literally bend the market to your will. And by some extent, consumers will as well. And the big 5 publishers certainly have enough resources to bend the market to their will, start trends, create media frenzies over book releases, sponsor private reviews, etc. Of course, it's more profitable to simply follow trends or publish something from an already well-known person or property, which is what they're doing more and more now, I feel like. But still, new unknown authors are getting published all the time. So why do they get published when so many others don't? And it's not about quality. 50 Shades of Grey exist. The After series exists. Don't tell me this is about quality. Now, this is just a theory. Again, just a theory. I don't have a ton of evidence. But my guess is that it's about ideology. Whether consciously or unconsciously, and I do personally believe it's mostly unconscious. No one's going to publish a book that's explicitly anti-capitalist, and if they do, it's certainly never going to be a utopian book. Why? Because, in truth, it's better for capitalism to criticize people, to criticize capitalism directly and point out the flaws and even the dystopian, that might be important later, elements of capitalism than to offer people another viable option. I think that's in part why we demonize the idea of utopia, because if utopianism truly has its roots in imagining a better world, then that assumes 2 things that our current system can't get people getting into their heads. One is that our system, all of our systems aren't perfect to begin with, and 2, that humanity can and should do better. And there is nothing more radical than believing in a better world is possible. But if utopian fiction is inherently anti-status quo and to extent anti-capitalist, then what does it mean when it comes to dystopian fiction? Well, that's something for the next video. Well, actually, the next several videos, because, surprise! This is actually a prologue. A really long prologue for my next series of videos analyzing the dystopian genre and how it both fosters and crushes revolutionary spirit within the popular zeitgeist. My next video is going to be about the Divergent series. I am also going to be doing a video on 1989, Fahrenheit 451, The Giver, Handmaid's Tale, the Selection series, and, I mean, obviously the Hunger Games, because, like, it's only probably the biggest dystopian series of all time. And, you know, if you have other dystopian books that you want to see in this series, now's the time to comment down below. The great thing about watching a channel that only gets about 15 views per video is that I actually take video suggestions, within reason, of course. So if you want to see more of my upcoming series, then hit the subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss another upload. And I will see you in the next video. Bye!